In today's video, imagine being surrounded by luxury, technology, and comfort, believing you're in the safest place on Earth. Now, imagine the exact opposite. You're stranded in the middle of the most hostile mountains on the planet. No food, no rescue, and no idea if you'll survive the next day. Two completely different scenarios, but connected by one thing. Both became some of the greatest tragedies in history. On one side, the Titanic, a massive ship, a symbol of power and innovation, considered practically unsinkable, that ended up at the bottom of the ocean, taking more than 1,500 people with it. On the other, a plane that crashed in the Andes in 1972, leaving survivors isolated for over 70 days, facing extreme cold, starvation, and unimaginable decisions. But here's what transforms this story. The question isn't just which one was bigger, it's which one was worse. Not in numbers, but in suffering. Not in impact, but in human experience. Because while one disaster unfolded in just a few hours, the other turned into a slow, brutal, almost unbearable fight for survival. Today, you're going to understand exactly what happened in each of these scenarios, and by the end, your answer might not be as simple as it seems. Because when you put everything side by side, the definition of a worse disaster completely changes. Titanic, the disaster that was never supposed to happen. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Titanic was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's confidence in technology, extreme luxury, advanced engineering, and a bold promise. It was practically unsinkable. But that confidence is exactly what made the disaster possible. On its maiden voyage, everything seemed perfect. Passengers from different classes shared the same destination, but not the same experience. And then, in the middle of the ocean, in the dead of night, the unthinkable happened. The Titanic struck an iceberg. There wasn't an explosion, no instant destruction, but the impact was enough to compromise the structure, and slowly, the Titanic began to sink, compartment by compartment, slow but inevitable. And as time passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. The ship was going under. What's even more terrifying is that it took around 2 hours to fully sink, enough time for panic to grow, for rushed decisions to be made, and for human error to turn deadly. There weren't enough lifeboats, and many of the ones that existed weren't used efficiently. While some managed to escape, others never even got the chance to try. Andes, when an accident becomes survival. Decades later, in 1972, a plane was flying over the Andes Mountains. On board were young people, many of them rugby players, traveling without any idea of what was about to happen. But a combination of human error, especially from the co-pilot, and severe weather conditions changed everything. The plane crashed into the mountains. The impact was devastating. Part of the aircraft was destroyed. Several people died instantly, and the survivors were left stranded in the middle of nowhere. No communication, no infrastructure, no immediate chance of rescue. At first, there was still hope, the belief that they would be found. But that hope was shattered when they discovered something devastating through a makeshift radio. The search had been called off. To the world, they were already dead. And from that moment on, this stopped being an accident and became a fight for survival. The first big difference. This is where the first major difference appears. The Titanic was a fast tragedy. The Andes were a prolonged one. In the first case, everything happened in hours. In the second, the suffering stretched over more than 70 days. And that difference in time completely changes how each disaster is experienced. But which one is harder to endure? Once it became clear the Titanic was going down, panic set in. And it wasn't just chaos, it was structured, unequal, and deeply unfair. Passengers were divided by class. The wealthy had more access to information and to lifeboats. Meanwhile, many others were left behind with no real chance of escape. And as time passed, the inevitable got closer, until the ship finally sank. Hundreds of people fell into the freezing water, and there, survival was nearly impossible. Hypothermia set in within minutes. There was no time to react, no time to fight. It was a quick end, brutal and inevitable. More than 1,500 people died that night. In the Andes, the problem wasn't dying, it was staying alive. In the first few days, survivors tried to hold on to hope. They rationed food, organized shelter, waited for rescue. But rescue never came. And as the days went by, things started to fall apart. Food ran out, and that's when the real nightmare began. They tried to survive on whatever they have left: leather, cotton, tiny scraps of food like chocolate bars and small bottles of whiskey. But it wasn't enough. Their bodies began to fail, weakness took over, and their minds started to break, until they reached the most extreme moment of all. They realized that to survive, they would have to eat the bodies of those who had already died. This decision wasn't immediate. It was debated, questioned, rejected before it was finally accepted. But it was that or death. And from that point on, survival was no longer just physical. It became psychological. Here's the most brutal part of the comparison. On the Titanic, decisions had to be made fast. Who gets on a lifeboat? Who stays behind? In the Andes, decisions never stopped. How much do we eat? Who can keep going? Who's reaching their limit? When it gets even worse. As if surviving the crash wasn't enough, another tragedy struck. An avalanche hit the group and killed several people who had already survived the initial impact. In other words, even after enduring the crash, the hunger, the freezing cold, danger was still everywhere. There was no safety, no stability, no sign of a happy ending, and that made the psychological toll even worse. The decision that changed everything. Weeks after the crash, 2 survivors made an unthinkable choice. Against all odds, they decided to go out and try to find help. They left on foot and began climbing the mountains. No map, no proper gear, no guarantee they would survive. It was an extremely risky mission, but it was the only chance. And somehow they made it. After more than 70 days, 16 people were finally rescued. So, which one was worse? Now we reach the core of the question. The Titanic, over 1,500 dead, a fast tragedy, intense suffering, but brief. The Andes, fewer deaths, over 70 days of suffering, extreme moral decisions. So the question changes completely. What's worse, dying in a few minutes or surviving for weeks, facing the impossible? The Titanic was devastating in scale. The Andes were devastating in experience. And that difference is what makes this comparison so uncomfortable. In the end, there's no simple answer. If you look only at numbers, the Titanic was bigger, more deaths, greater immediate impact. But if you look at human experience, the Andes reveals something deeper. People pushed to the absolute limit, forced to make decisions that challenge any moral logic. The Titanic was a collective tragedy, fast, inevitable. The Andes were a slow battle, individual, psychological. One disaster killed more people. The other showed just how far human beings can go when they have no other choice. And maybe that's what really defines what worse means. Not just how many lives were lost, but what those lives had to endure before the end. Because in the end, the true horror might not be death, but survival. And now, after everything, the question is still open. Which one was truly worse? Want to hear more random facts that might change your life? Or not? Follow us here and on our other socials. Everything's down below in the video description. Also, drop a like, leave a comment telling us what you thought about the video and what you want to see next. And don't forget to share this with someone you think will enjoy it too.